The longship had been at sea for 11 days. Its name was Ormond the Serpent. It was 60 feet long and narrow, built from overlapping planks of oak that flexed slightly with each wave, absorbing the movement of the water rather than fighting against it. The planks were sealed with tarred wool pressed into the seams, and the smell of that tar was always present, mixing with the salt air and the smell of the men and the wet wool of their cloaks. The watch rotation meant that each man slept for 4 hours and was awake for 4 hours throughout the night. When it was Irik's time to sleep, he lay down on the deck boards and pulled his cloak around him and closed his eyes, and the ship moved beneath him with its slow and constant rocking, and the sound of the water against the hull was close and loud in the darkness, a deep rushing sound that was almost like breathing. There were 32 men aboard. They slept in shifts, wrapped in cloaks and sealskin blankets, lying on the bare wooden deck between the rowing benches. There was no shelter. There was no roof. The sky above them was the ceiling, and the sea around them was the floor, and between those two things there was nothing but wind and cold air, and the slow rolling of the ship. Irik was one of the younger men. He was 23 years old, and this was his third voyage. He had not yet grown fully accustomed to the cold, though he had learned to stop expecting warmth. Expecting warmth was the mistake of men who had not been at sea long enough. The cold was simply the condition of existence on a long ship, and the only sensible response was to accept it completely. His position on the ship was near the stern, where he helped manage the steering oar when called upon, and otherwise sat at his rowing bench and pulled when the wind dropped and the sail went slack. The oar was heavy. It was made of ash, the same pale wood as the rowing oars, and it had been worn smooth by many hands over many voyages before his. The provisions on the ship were simple: dried fish, hard flat bread that had been baked weeks before departure and had the texture of wood, dried meat packed in barrels, a small cask of soured whey that served as the primary drink, water being too precious and too prone to fouling on long voyages. The food was eaten cold. There was no way to cook on the open deck of a moving ship. A fire would have destroyed the vessel. Irik ate his evening portion before the watch change. A piece of dried fish the length of his hand, dense and salty, and requiring significant chewing before it could be swallowed. 2 pieces of the hard flatbread. A cup of the soured whey, which had a sharp and unpleasant taste that he had over 3 voyages almost stopped noticing. He ate slowly and without pleasure, sitting on his bench with his back to the wind, looking at the dark water sliding past the hull. The North Atlantic in late September was not a friendly sea. The waves were not enormous. They had seen worse, would see worse before the voyage ended, but they were large enough to make the ship work constantly, rising and falling in a rhythm that was just irregular enough to prevent the body from fully relaxing. Every few minutes a wave would strike the hull at a slightly different angle, and the ship would shudder and tilt, and the men would brace without thinking. The other men breathed around him in the darkness. Some of them were asleep already. One man near the bow was snoring softly. Somewhere above him the sail moved in the wind with a low and even sound. The ship rose slowly on a long swell and held at the top for a moment, and then descended just as slowly on the other side, and the water ran along the hull in its quiet way, and the cold was the cold. And Irik lay still on the hard boards of the deck. The ship moved around him. He could feel every motion of it through the boards. the slow rise and fall, the occasional sharper movement when a larger wave passed under the keel. The sounds were constant, the creak of the rigging, the low moan of the wind in the sail, the water against the hull, the breathing and shifting of the other men nearby. None of these sounds were alarming. They were simply the sounds of the ship doing what it was built to do. Eirik watched Gunnar for a while before his sleep shift. The old man stood near the steering oar with his arms crossed, and his eyes moving slowly across the horizon, or what could be seen of the horizon through the overcast darkness. He did not look concerned. He rarely looked concerned. This was either because he genuinely was not concerned or because he had learned long ago that the expression of concern served no useful purpose on a longship. He thought briefly about the things men think about at sea when they are tired and cold and far from land. His family's farm, the smell of the indoor fire, the weight of a dry blanket, food that had been cooked and was warm. These were not painful thoughts. They were simply the thoughts that came, and he had learned to let them come and go without holding on to them, because holding on to them made the cold feel colder and the hardness of the deck feel harder. When the watch change came, Eirik lay down on the deck. The boards were hard beneath him and slightly damp, as they always were, and the cold came up through them from the water below. He arranged his cloak and pulled the sealskin over his legs, and found the position he had found on many previous nights, slightly curled with his knees drawn up and his hands tucked under his arms for warmth. The motion of the ship slowed in his awareness as his body grew heavier. The sounds became less distinct. The creak of the rigging was still there, but it was further away now, or it seemed further away, and the water against the hull was a continuous sound that his mind had stopped parsing into individual impacts and was simply receiving as a whole, the way one eventually receives any sound that has been present long enough. The sky that night was overcast. No stars were visible. The navigator, an older man named Gunnar, kept his position by other means, by the feel of the swell direction, by the color of the water, by the behavior of seabirds when they appeared. He had been doing this for 30 years, and he was rarely wrong. The other men trusted him without discussing it, which is the kind of trust that develops between people who depend on each other for their lives over a long period of time. The Serpent sailed on through the darkness. The men slept in their shifts. Gunnar stood at the stern and watched the invisible horizon. The wind held steady from the northwest. The waves continued their long, slow conversation with the hull, and somewhere on the deck, between the rowing benches wrapped in wool and sealskin, Eirik breathed slowly in the cold night air and slept. His eyes had been closed for some time. He was not certain when exactly they had closed. The boundary between waking and not waking was not a sharp line on a long ship in the dark. It was a gradual softening, a slow withdrawal from the cold and the sound and the motion into something quieter and warmer that existed somewhere behind closed eyes, and he moved toward it without effort, the way the ship moved through the water, without resistance, carried forward by something larger than itself. Around him, the other men were waking in the same gradual way. Nobody spoke much in the first minutes after the watch change. There was nothing particularly useful to say. The sea was still the sea. The sky was still gray. The ship was still moving. These facts required no discussion. He sat up slowly. His back ached from the boards. His neck was stiff from the angle at which he had slept. His hands, when he pulled them from under his arms, were cold, despite having been tucked away all night. He flexed his fingers one at a time, feeling the stiffness in each joint. Eirik stood carefully, bracing against the motion of the hull. His legs were unsteady for a moment, the way legs always are after sleeping on a moving ship. He held the gunwale with one hand until the feeling passed, then moved to his rowing bench and sat down. The morning came without announcement. There was no sunrise visible through the clouds. The sky simply shifted from one shade of dark gray to a lighter shade of dark gray, and the men who had been on watch through the night recognized this change and began the process of waking the others. Eirik felt a boot against his shoulder, not a kick, just a firm pressure. He opened his eyes to the same gray sky he had closed them under, and for a moment he did not move, simply registering the return to consciousness. Around him the other men were waking in the same gradual way. Nobody spoke much in the first minutes after the watch change. There was nothing particularly useful to say. The sea was still the sea. The sky was still gray. The ship was still moving. These facts required no discussion. He sat up slowly. His back ached from the boards. His neck was stiff from the angle at which he had slept. His hands, when he pulled them from under his arms, were cold, despite having been tucked away all night. He flexed his fingers one at a time, feeling the stiffness in each joint. Eirik stood carefully, bracing against the motion of the hull. His legs were unsteady for a moment, the way legs always are after sleeping on a moving ship. He held the gunwale with one hand until the feeling passed, then moved to his rowing bench and sat down. The morning came without announcement. There was no sunrise visible through the clouds. The sky simply shifted from one shade of dark gray to a lighter shade of dark gray, and the men who had been on watch through the night recognized this change and began the process of waking the others. Eirik felt a boot against his shoulder, not a kick, just a firm pressure. He opened his eyes to the same gray sky he had closed them under, and for a moment he did not move, simply registering the return to consciousness. The wind strengthened slightly as the morning progressed. The sail filled more completely, and the ship's speed increased, and the sound of the water against the hull changed in pitch, becoming slightly higher and more continuous. The men at the rowing benches shipped their oars since they were not needed. Eirik watched him and thought about what it meant to have done something for 30 years. To have spent 30 years on ships in the North Atlantic, reading water and sky and wind. He tried to imagine 30 years and could not fully do it. He was 23. 30 years ago he had not yet been born. The morning passed in this way. Small tasks, long silences, the movement of the ship, the sound of the water, the gray sky above, which showed no sign of changing into anything other than what it was. A seabird appeared at some point and circled the ship twice at a distance, and then flew away in a direction that Gunnar watched carefully for a long moment before returning his gaze to the horizon. With nothing to do but wait, some of the men slept again. Others talked quietly among themselves. One man produced a small piece of carved bone and examined it, turning it in his hands. Another simply sat and looked at the water with the expression of someone who has looked at water for so long that it no longer registers as particularly interesting. Gunnar had not slept, or if he had slept, it had been for a very short time, and in a way that was not obvious. He stood where he had been standing when Eirik fell asleep, near the stern, his arms crossed, his eyes on the horizon. He was drinking from a small wooden cup. He did not appear tired. Eirik checked his equipment. This was something he did every morning at sea, not because anything was likely to have changed overnight, but because the checking of equipment was a useful occupation, and usefulness was a virtue on a ship where there was often very little to do. The morning ration was the same as the evening ration: dried fish, hard flatbread, a cup of the soured whey. Eirik ate his portion slowly, chewing thoroughly, looking out at the water. The waves were slightly smaller this morning than they had been the night before, or perhaps they were the same size, and he was simply more accustomed to them. His axe was wrapped in oiled cloth and secured beneath his bench. He unwrapped it and ran his thumb carefully along the edge. It was still sharp. He rewrapped it and secured it again. His knife was on his belt where it always was. His spare cloak was rolled and tied at the stern with the other men's spare gear. The ship rose on a long, slow swell and held for a moment at the top, suspended between the rise and the fall, and then descended on the other side. And the water ran along the hull with its quiet rushing sound, and the wind moved steadily from the northwest, and Eirik lay still on the boards of the Serpent in the cold dark of the North Atlantic, and the night continued around him, unhurried and indifferent and vast. At midday, or what was estimated to be midday, since the sun was not visible, the men were given a slightly larger portion of dried meat in addition to the usual flatbread. This was not a daily occurrence. It happened when the navigator or the ship's leader judged that morale required some small improvement, or when the provisions were plentiful enough to allow it. Today it seemed to be a simple acknowledgment that the morning had been long and cold and without incident. By the time the light began to fail again, that same gradual dimming from gray to darker gray, Eirik had been awake for most of the day and was ready for his sleep shift. He ate his evening ration and drank his cup of soured whey and arranged his cloak and his sealskin and lay down on the same section of deck he had occupied the night before. The afternoon watch was quiet. The wind remained steady. The ship continued its progress across the gray water. Two men played a simple game with carved pieces on a board marked into the deck planking, moving pieces back and forth according to rules Eirik had never fully learned. The sound of the pieces on the wood was small and regular and oddly pleasant in the constant noise of the ship. Eirik breathed slowly in the cold air. The deck was hard beneath him. The cloak was not quite warm enough. The soured whey sat uneasily in his stomach in the way it sometimes did. None of these things were problems that could be solved. They were simply the conditions of where he was and what he was doing. Somewhere near the bow a man coughed once and was quiet. The rigging moved with the wind. Gunnar stood at the stern in the darkness, reading things in the water and the sky that most men could not read. The Serpent moved through the night sea as it had moved through the day sea, steadily and without complaint, carrying its 32 men toward a shore that was still 2 days away. The ship moved in its familiar way beneath him. The sounds were the same sounds. The cold was the same cold. He closed his eyes and felt the motion of the hull through the boards and listened to the water running along the sides of the ship in the darkness, that continuous sound that was both close and somehow distant, both specific and general. After eating, he sat for a while with his back against the gunwale and his face turned slightly away from the wind. The wind had a temperature that was not quite cold enough to be called bitter, but was consistently uncomfortable. The kind of cold that does not shock but simply persists, working its way through wool and leather over the course of hours until it has established itself in the bones. He accepted them in the way he had learned to accept them, which was not dramatically or philosophically, but simply practically, the way a person accepts weather or tide or the weight of an oar as facts of the world that exist independently of opinion and require no particular response beyond continued presence. Eirik ate the dried meat slowly. It was tough and very salty, and tasted primarily of the barrel it had been stored in. He chewed each piece for a long time before swallowing, partly because it required it, and partly because eating slowly made the ration last longer, and making things last was a skill that had its own satisfaction at sea. He thought about the destination. They were sailing to a trading settlement on the eastern coast, a place he had been to once before on his second voyage. He remembered it as a collection of timber buildings near a river mouth, smoky and loud and smelling of fish and livestock. He had not found it particularly appealing, but it had been on land, and land after 11 days at sea has a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. So he lay on the wet deck in the rain and waited for either the rain to stop or for morning to come, whichever arrived first. This was the only available response, and he had learned not to waste energy wishing for alternatives that did not exist. Wishing for alternatives that did not exist was a luxury of men on land. The men who were sleeping woke not because anyone called them, but because the rain on their faces was impossible to sleep through. There was a general movement of cloaks being pulled higher and bodies being repositioned to present less surface to the weather. Though on an open deck in the rain there is no position that is truly better than any other. The men looked in the direction indicated. Most of them could see the smudge. Whether it was land was harder to say. It was the color of land rather than the color of cloud, which is a distinction that sounds clearer in description than it is in practice, since both land and cloud at great distance tend toward the same dark gray. By the time the gray light returned, the rain had reduced to a fine mist. Not quite stopped, but close enough to stopped that the distinction felt meaningful. The men sat up and shook water from their cloaks and looked at each other with the expressions of people who have shared an unpleasant experience without having anything particularly useful to say about it. Gunnar appeared unmoved by the rain. His cloak was wet like everyone else's, but he stood at the stern with his usual stillness, drinking from his cup, watching the horizon. Whatever he saw there either reassured him or was simply neutral information, because his expression did not change in any direction. Two men bailed intermittently through the night, scooping water from the lowest point of the hull with wooden buckets and pouring it over the side. The sound of the bailing was rhythmic and quiet, a soft sloshing followed by a pour, repeated every few minutes. Eirik listened to it in the darkness and found it almost useful as something to focus on other than the cold and the wet. The mist burned off slowly as the morning progressed. Not because the sun appeared, it did not appear, but because the air warmed slightly and the moisture in it dispersed. By mid-morning, the visibility had improved to the point where the horizon was a clear line again, and the water had a different quality of light on it, less flat and gray than it had been in the rain. And sometime in the deep middle of that second night, the rain began. It did not begin suddenly. It began the way most things begin at sea, gradually and without announcement. First as a dampness in the air that was difficult to distinguish from the spray, and then as something more definite, individual drops that could be felt on the face and hands, and then as rain proper, steady and cold and arriving at a slight angle with the wind. The ship altered course slightly, a few degrees to the southeast. The steering oar was adjusted. The sail was trimmed. These changes were small, and the men made them without excitement, because excitement on a long ship is a resource to be spent carefully, and the smudge on the horizon had not yet earned it. The morning ration was eaten wet. The flatbread had absorbed moisture overnight and was softer than usual in an unpleasant way, its texture somewhere between its normal hardness and something that was not quite bread anymore. The dried fish was unchanged, since it was already dry in the way that things become when they have been dried past the point of ordinary dryness. Eirik ate it without comment. Eirik looked at it for a long time. He wanted it to be land. He was aware that wanting it to be land was not a reliable guide to whether it actually was land, and he tried to look at it with the same neutral attention that Gunnar brought to everything at sea. It did not fully work. He still wanted it to be land. Eirik pulled his cloak over his head and lay still. The rain drummed on the wool above his face. It was cold, and it soaked through the outer layer of the cloak within a few minutes, and then it was cold and wet, which was worse than simply cold in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that anyone who has been wet in the cold will recognize immediately. Land, possibly. A smudge on the horizon to the southeast that might be the coastline they were looking for, or might be clouds sitting low over the water. Gunnar thought it was land. He had thought it was land for perhaps an hour before mentioning it, which was his habit, to be certain enough before speaking that the speaking required no qualification. Gunnar studied the horizon for a long time around mid-morning. Then he said something quietly to the man nearest him, and that man relayed it to the next, and within a few minutes the information had passed through the ship in the way information passes on a long ship, quietly and efficiently from one man to the next. The rain lasted for several hours. It was not a violent rain. It was the persistent kind, steady and unhurried, the kind that does not announce itself as a storm but simply continues until everything it touches is thoroughly wet. The sail above was heavy with it. The deck boards were slick. Water ran along the hull in small streams toward the drainage holes cut near the keel. Through the afternoon the smudge grew. It grew slowly, the way distant things always grow when approached by a ship, which is to say almost imperceptibly for a long time, and then with gathering definition. By mid-afternoon it had resolved itself from a smudge into a shape, and the shape was unmistakably the shape of land, a low dark line with a slightly uneven profile, hills or high ground behind a flat coastal edge. The men's behavior did not change dramatically with the confirmation that it was land. There was no cheering, no celebration. There was simply a slight shift in atmosphere, a barely perceptible easing of the collective tension that had been present for 11 days, and had been so constant that it had become invisible, only becoming noticeable now in its slight reduction. Eirik laid down and pulled his cloak around him and closed his eyes. Through the hull, he could feel the anchor rope working slightly in the current, a slow periodic tension and release. The water moved against the planks beside his head. The smell of land was still faintly present in the air, or perhaps he was imagining it now, having smelled it once and wished it to continue. It would not reach the settlement before dark. Gunnar judged they would anchor offshore for the night and enter the river mouth in the morning light, when the sandbanks and rocks could be seen. This was the cautious approach, and it was the correct one, and nobody argued with it, because arguing with Gunnar about navigational decisions was not something that experienced men did. So they anchored as the light failed, in the lee of a headland that blocked the worst of the wind, close enough to shore that Eirik could smell land for the first time in 11 days. The smell was extraordinary in its ordinariness. Wet earth, vegetation, something faintly smoky from a fire somewhere on shore. He sat on his bench and breathed it in, without trying to make anything of it, simply receiving it. The ship was quieter at anchor than it had been underway. Without the constant drive of the sail or the rhythm of the oars, the sounds were different, smaller, more intimate. The water moved against the anchored hull with a different sound than it had made in open sea, lighter and less insistent. The rigging was still. The evening ration was eaten. The watch was set. The men arranged themselves for sleep with the slightly different quality of arrangement that comes when land is close, not more comfortable, exactly, since the deck was as hard as it had always been, but somehow less resistant, as though the body understood that this was nearly the last night it would spend in this position for some time. Eirik felt it in himself, a small loosening somewhere in his chest, not joy exactly, more like the beginning of the end of something, the knowledge that the particular kind of effort that sea voyaging requires, the constant low-level management of cold and discomfort and uncertainty, was approaching its conclusion for this particular voyage. It did not matter. He was warm enough. The deck was what the deck was. Tomorrow there would be land underfoot, and a fire somewhere, and food that had been cooked. Tonight there was the ship and the dark water and the sound of other men breathing in the cold air and the slow movement of the hull and the rope and the tide. He breathed slowly. The anchor held. The Serpent rested on the dark water in the shelter of the headland, its hull moving in the small way that anchored ships move, patient and quiet, carrying its sleeping men through the last hours of the voyage toward the morning and the river mouth and the shore. Gunnar took his position at the steering oar. He said something to the men at the sail, and they adjusted it, and the ship began to move with purpose toward the coast. His sound changed again as the hull came up to speed, the water finding its familiar register against the planks, and the men at the rowing benches sat ready in case the wind dropped near the shore. Default text. He stood and stepped over the gunwale onto the dock. His legs were uncertain on the solid planking, the same uncertainty he felt every time after a long voyage, his body expecting the movement that was no longer there and compensating for an absence. He stood still until it passed, which took less than a minute, and then he was simply standing on land. Then he turned and walked up from the dock toward the settlement, his boots finding solid ground with each step, the stillness of the earth receiving him without comment, as it always had, as it always would, patient and indifferent and entirely completely still. He woke before the watch change and lay still for a moment, looking up at that sky. The pale blue between the clouds was a significant thing after so many days of gray. He did not think about it in those terms while he was looking at it. He simply looked at it, and his body registered something that might have been called relief if he had been inclined to name it. Default text. Eirik shipped his oar and set it in the rack and sat for a moment without moving. The ship was not moving. This was a simple fact, and yet his body received it as something more than simple. A cessation, a completion, the end of the particular kind of attention that a moving ship demands from everyone aboard it at all times, even when sleeping. He would sleep tonight in a building, on a floor, probably with other men, in the way that travelers sleep in settlements where they have no permanent place. The floor would be hard. There would likely be smoke from the fire and the sounds of other men, and the smell of the settlement, which was not a particularly pleasant smell. But the floor would not move. The headland was visible to the northwest, darker than the sky behind it. The coast stretched away to the southeast, low and green, closer than it had seemed the night before. The river mouth was not yet visible, but Gunnar had said it was there, and Gunnar was not wrong about these things. The anchor rope hung straight down into the water, still and taut. Gunnar brought the ship in alongside the dock with the practiced ease of a man who has docked ships in many ports over 30 years. The hull came alongside the planking with a gentle bump, and men on the dock took the lines thrown to them and made them fast to the posts, and the Serpent was still for the first time in 13 days. Eirik finished the broth and held the empty cup for a while, looking at the fire. He was tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of individual nights at sea, a deeper and more settled tiredness that comes at the end of something extended, when the body finally allows itself to acknowledge the full account of what has been asked of it. Eirik pulled his oar and felt the familiar weight of the water against the blade. The rowing in a river was different from rowing at sea. The water was calmer, and the resistance more predictable, and the progress more visible. The banks moving past on either side at a rate that could be measured against fixed points. A particular tree, a bend in the channel, a post driven into the bank for some long-forgotten purpose. He held his hands out toward it. The cold that had been in his fingers since the rain 2 nights ago began to ease. The feeling returned slowly, a tingling first, and then something more normal. He turned his hands over and held the backs of them toward the fire, and then turned them back again, and stood there doing this for some time. The men woke gradually around him. The watch change happened with its usual quietness. Eirik sat up and flexed his hands and rolled his neck, and felt the familiar inventory of aches at 11. Nights on hard boards produces in a body that has not yet reached the age where such things are permanent, but has not yet reached the age where they are fully ignorable either. Someone put a cup into his hand, a wooden cup containing something hot. He looked at it. Broth of some kind, dark and salty, and with a layer of fat floating on the surface. He drank it slowly, holding the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth of it move down through him in a way that the cold of the voyage had made him forget was possible. The morning of the 13th day came clear. For the first time since they had left the home fjord, the sky was not entirely covered. There were clouds, but they were high and thin, and between them the sky was a pale blue that had the quality of something recently washed. The light on the water was different from anything Eirik had seen in nearly 2 weeks. Actual light, with direction and angle to it, casting small shadows from the wave crests. The ground under the dock was solid and cold, and did not move. This was remarkable, in the way that only things can be remarkable when their absence has been noticed for a long time. He stood on it and felt its stillness through the soles of his boots, and said nothing about it because there was nothing useful to say. Eirik set the empty cup down on a post beside the fire. He rolled his shoulders once, slowly. He looked up at the pale blue sky between the high, thin clouds, the same sky that had been there when he woke that morning, still present, still clear, still ordinary in the way that clear skies are ordinary when they have not been absent for a long time. Gunnar steered them carefully through the entrance. He read the bottom through the color of the water, avoiding the pale green of the sandbanks, and following the darker channel where the water was deep enough for the ship's draft. He made small adjustments to the steering oar without speaking. The man at the oars pulled when he indicated easy, measured strokes. The settlement was waking around him. More fires were being built up. The goods from the ship were being carried up from the dock to the storage buildings. Men were talking in groups. Someone was laughing at something, a sound that seemed louder than it would have seemed on land under ordinary circumstances. The river mouth appeared as they rounded a low point of land. It was wider than Eirik remembered, or perhaps he had simply forgotten in the time between voyages. Brown water spread out from it in a fan shape where it met the sea, the fresh water sitting above the salt water for some distance before the two mixed. Gulls were working the mixing zone, diving repeatedly into the shallow water. Someone from the settlement had built a fire near the dock. It was a large fire built up in anticipation of the ship's arrival, and the heat from it was considerable and immediate. Eirik moved toward it and stood close enough to feel it on his face and hands, and the warmth was the warmth of a fire, which is a different kind of warmth from any other kind, more immediate and more direct. The anchor was raised as the light strengthened. It came up heavy with weed and dripping, and 2 men hauled it over the side and secured it at the bow while a third coiled the rope beside it. The ship moved as the anchor left the bottom, responding to the current that had been held in check all night, swinging slowly toward the southeast. That was enough. That was more than enough. He looked at the fire for a while longer and felt the warmth of it on his face and listened to the sounds of the settlement going about its morning, and the river moved past the dock behind him with its quiet brown current. And somewhere downstream where the river met the sea, the gulls were still working the mixing zone, and the serpent rested against the dock with its lines made fast. The smell of the river was different from the smell of the sea. Less salt, more mud and vegetation, something organic and green in it, the smell of things growing in shallow water. After 11 days of salt air, it was strange and particular, and Eirik breathed it in with the attention one gives to things that are unusual before they become ordinary. The morning ration was eaten. For the last time on this voyage, Eirik chewed his dried fish and his hard flatbread, and drank his cup of soured whey, and he was aware as he ate it that it was the last time, and this awareness gave the food a quality it did not otherwise possess, which is the quality of things that are nearly finished. After perhaps an hour of rowing, the settlement appeared. It was as he remembered it. Timber buildings on raised ground above the left bank. A dock of rough planks extending into the river, smoke rising from several fires into the clear morning air. There were people visible on the dock, standing watching the longship approach with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting. The river closed around them on both sides. The banks were low and covered with coarse grass and rushes. The wind dropped as they moved inland, sheltered by the rising ground on either side, and the men shipped their oars and took up rowing properly, settling into the rhythm that 11 days at sea had maintained in their arms and backs and shoulders. Around him the other men were disembarking, carrying their gear, greeting the people from the settlement who had come down to the dock. There was talk and the moving of goods and the practical business of arrival that follows every voyage. Eirik watched it for a moment from where he stood, still adjusting to the stillness beneath his feet.